This is the final video for Unit 1. We're going to look at notes, chords, and scales in a little bit more detail and think about how these influence the way that music sounds to us, the way that we perceive music, the way that composers write music, and the way that games and films and things like that use music to underscore the action. So, we've talked already about staff notation on the treble and bass clefs, and now I'd like to look at the keyboard to illustrate something else. So, you can see the notes on the keyboard here labeled. This is one single octave. And I'd like to use this diagram to illustrate the principle of the whole step and the half step. Essentially, if you look here, there are 12 unique notes going all the way up from C, C sharp, D, etc., all the way up to B before you start to repeat. So within those 12 notes, what we call a step can be of two sizes. Essentially, in C major, if you look at only the white keys of the keyboard, you see whole steps here from C to D, or from D to E. And we call these whole steps because they're actually two notes. We're skipping the C sharp in between C and D, or we're going from D to E while skipping the D sharp or the E flat. I should note that in these cases, these are the same notes, but they're frequently called by two different names depending on how they're being used. So, whole step is two notes, whereas a half step, C up to C sharp, is the closest possible note. So for example, a whole step sounds something like do, re, do, whereas a half step is do, di, do, versus the whole step. So in a lot of ways you can hear that a whole step sounds kind of stable. It's the more common interval in a scale, whereas the half step, or a minor second, can be a little bit more dramatic. Da, da, da. So the scale, for example, if we look at the C major scale, it's made up of a couple of whole steps and then a couple of strategically placed half steps. And what makes a major scale different from a minor scale is actually the number of half steps and the placement of those half steps. So for example, C major sounds like C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So you hear that there are two half steps in there, but that it's mostly whole steps. Here's the major scale illustrated again. You can see whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half down there at the bottom. So just to give this to you again, let me sing a little bit lower. C, D, E, F, there was a half step. G, B, A, B, and then another half step to C. Da, 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 da. The major scale tends to sound a little bit happier. If we lower certain notes, such as the E here, or the A to the A flat, you change the position of the half steps, and we end up with something like do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So it ends up sounding much more dramatic. A lot of times minor scales are used to underscore sad moments. They're used for tension. And the difference here is really in the interval from the first note of the scale up to the third. And as you'll see, that's very important in chords as well. But we have sort of C, E natural, which is very, again, kind of sunny, happy, optimistic, whereas C, E flat is much darker, much more dramatic, oftentimes more sad. You also have the G up to A interval, which becomes G to A flat. When you make it a minor second, is something like G, A, or G, A flat, G. Those are sort of the two big characteristics of sounds, of the scales. So you don't need to know a lot about the major versus the minor scale, but it is useful to understand the difference, understand how a scale is put together out of a series of steps of different sizes, mostly whole steps and a couple of strategic half steps, and that the placement of those half steps there is what sort of dictates whether the scale sounds kind of happy and sunny, or whether it sounds darker and more dramatic. These are always kind of reductive ways of talking about major and minor scales. It's possible to write sad music in major. It's possible to write triumphant music or even happy music in minor, and certainly beautiful music in minor. But in general, people tend to reach for major or minor keys and major and minor chords in certain contexts. If you think, for example, of Star Wars, you know, the Rebels themes are all in major, whereas Darth Vader Imperial March is in minor. So they're kind of classic juxtapositions. A lot of superhero themes are in major, whereas a lot of sort of action music tends to be in minor, or tragic music tends to be in minor a lot of the time. The other big important thing to know is that we don't just use scales. You know, melodies tend to be made up out of the notes of a given scale. You know, a melody in C major is going to have mostly the notes of C major. But music tends to actually be written using chords. So if we look at this, the bottom notes here spell out the C major chord, and then each of the two upper notes spells out what we call a triad or a chord. So each scale has 7 distinctive chords that are built on it. And harmonies are made by changing from one chord to the next. Usually you're selecting chords based on what sounds right. There's kind of a specific order that chords frequently end up going in. We won't talk about that a lot, but it tends to have to do with the central tonic chord, C major, alternating with G major, the dominant. And usually there are several chords in between, something like, you know, F, the 4th chord, or D minor, the 2nd chord. And chord progressions tend to start in one place, then they wander around a little bit, maybe they hit a couple of other chords, then they go to the dominant. You'll notice that the bottom note of this G, by no coincidence, is also the top note of the C chord. They're very closely related. And the dominant will tend to take you back to the tonic, in this case, C. It's kind of the musical center. It ends up being something that's pretty audible. You can think of, for example, C, F, G. C has a real sense of finality to it. So chords are built usually by skipping one note and taking the next, skipping one note and taking the next until you've got a unit made up of 3 notes. So for example, we take C, we skip D, we take E, we skip F, and we take G. As I said, from C to D is called a step, a whole step in this case. From C to E is what's called a third. So chords are built up of thirds. So C, E, G is a chord, D, F, A is a chord, and you can go all the way down in this chart and see how you can select the notes of C major and form its 7 unique chords. Finally, when we're talking about chord progressions, it's useful to be able to talk about different keys. You know, pieces of music are in a lot of different keys, but we're interested in what makes them structurally similar. So we don't usually talk about, oh, this is a D major chord that goes to E minor. It's more useful to say, oh, this is a 1 chord that goes to a 2 chord. Because no matter what key you're in, the 1 chords always act similarly, 4 chords always act similarly. So it's useful to be able to compare pieces of music kind of across each other. So we use Roman numerals as a kind of shorthand for this is the central chord, the 1, or this is the 5 chord, the dominant chord, the second most important one. So it's useful to be able to talk about different pieces of music kind of across keys without having to use the specific chord name. We use this shorthand that tells us how it acts.